Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This episode is the midpoint in our new mini-series, Cameron's Referendums, in which we're looking at David Cameron's three great gambles on plebiscites: the 2011 electoral reform vote, the AV referendum. Next, we're looking at the 2016 Brexit vote, the one that he lost. And in this episode, we're looking at what, for me, as I said at the end of the last episode, is actually by far the most significant question that was put, and that's the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, the moment when the very existence of the United Kingdom was on the ballot.
It's not every day that a country that's existed for over 3 centuries voluntarily gives voters an opportunity to end that country's existence. But that is, in fact, what the David Cameron government did in 2014. Personally, I thought it was an extraordinary and irresponsible act. I would have thought that one of the key responsibilities of government is to keep the state going. And here the Cameron government pretty nonchalantly was ready to bring an end to our country. For those reasons alone, I think that David Cameron was one of the most reckless and disastrous prime ministers we've ever had. But anyway, we'll probably get onto all of that. Before we get onto it, though, Lee, I think we need to understand something about our country, its history, particularly for our international listeners.
So this is going to have to be very broad brushstroke, of course, but for the benefit of international listeners in particular, it's worth pointing out a few things. Firstly, that the United Kingdom is both a nation state and a multi-nation state, in that there is the sense in which we are British, but also the sense in which there are constituent nations within the United Kingdom and national identities that overlap with it. Of course, English, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish as well. And within this mix that sits within the United Kingdom, it's also worth pointing out that it is a very imbalanced one, because the UK is not unique in being multiple nations or national identities within one unitary state, although now somewhat devolved. But what does set the UK apart really is the fact that one part of it, England, dominates so much. So it's about 85% of the entire UK population sits within England. Another point just worth noting is that Scotland has been a separate country to England before. Although whilst the way in which countries in the past and territorial boundaries and elsewhere have merged can sometimes be quite messy, often even violent, it's not really the case if you think about the way in which England and Scotland came together, although there has been violence in that relationship when you go even further back. There were really two big stages. There's the Union of Crowns, which comes in 1603. The King of Scotland, James VI, also becomes the King of England, becomes James I in England. So you get this common crown covering both England and Scotland. And then in 1707, you get the Union of Parliaments and the Act of Union, which is when you then get the Kingdom of Great Britain. And interestingly, and this is something which is sometimes forgotten, it is done as a voluntary arrangement. It's not a case of one part conquering another in order to form a new state. This is something that the Scottish Parliament, as it was at the time, votes for. It votes to end itself effectively and to become part of a single parliament in Westminster. If we frame this in terms of something we've become quite used to in recent years and may use again in the next episode, Brendan Sims wrote about it like this, quote, "In 1707, Scotland and England established a parliamentary and defence union, as well as a single market and a customs union in a new state called Great Britain. And then from 1707 to 1999, Scotland had no separate parliament, but was of course represented in Westminster in the Commons, in the Lords, and governed in various different ways." In this romp through centuries of history, a really important staging post is 1999, and that's when the Scottish Parliament is re-established or reconvenes following a devolution referendum. So that's, broadly speaking, the landscape, that there's a multi-nation state called the United Kingdom. There's constituent national identities within it. The Scottish Parliament, as was basically voted to end itself as part of the Act of Union at the beginning of the 18th century, and then at the very end of the 20th century was re-established. And throughout it all, there has been a chunk of people within Scotland of varying sizes who have always hankered for this sense of Scotland as its own separate, not just nation, but also state.
And it's just also worth clarifying that the term United Kingdom is a 19th century term, which came about to describe the union of Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland. So it's after the 1800 Act of Union, when Ireland becomes integrated into the same polity, that the term the United Kingdom is used.
Richard is right to be specific there about the language. And that actually reminds us of what has been within what became the United Kingdom in the 19th century, the most difficult and the most contested part of that United Kingdom, which of course is the status of Ireland. And without going into that in too much detail, it's worth just mentioning because by comparison to the status of Ireland being part of the United Kingdom, Scotland's place within it has actually been staggeringly uncontroversial. I mean, Colin Kidd wrote about British unionism, that it was so well established as to need no defence or justification until around the 1970s. So really for a very long time, like I say, there were always some people who longed for this idea of Scotland the separate, but in fact unionism really became the dominant ideology in Scotland, or as some people would have called it, the ultra-unionist perhaps, Northern Britain. But you do see that begin to change really in the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, with the development of the SNP as a political party, into the 1970s with the discovery of North Sea oil and the way in which that changes some of the economic questions around Scotland and its ability to go it alone. And then in the 1970s also with the question of devolution, when there's a referendum on whether or not Scotland should have a Scottish Parliament, but which is defeated on the terms that are set out. And then at the very end of the century, with the agreement via a referendum again, that there would be a reformed Scottish Parliament.
Yes, from the 1970s, the 1990s, there's this lively debate about whether Scotland should have some form of what used to be called in the Irish debates home rule. And of course, the debate over Irish home rule, or what we would probably call today Irish devolution, split politics in the late 19th and early 20th century and culminated, obviously, in a civil war. In the case of Scotland, this first devolution referendum, as you mentioned, Lee, in 1979 failed, and then in 1999, 20 years later, it was successful, just after the death of Princess Diana, not very many months after the election of the new Labour government took place in September of 1997. The Labour government brought it in with the view that a devolved Scottish Assembly or a separate Scottish Parliament, where certain policy matters would be decided in Scotland rather than in the United Kingdom Parliament for the whole of the United Kingdom, reflected an already pre-existing arrangement where the Scotland office, which was part of the cabinet and a government department in Whitehall, had already reflected some of the differentiations of policy that took place within Scotland versus the United Kingdom. And so initially, devolution was thought to be a way of providing some degree of democratic legitimacy to this variation in policy that had already occurred in Scotland. But I think really anyone who was clear-eyed about it could see that this was not actually just some kind of technical adjustment or upgraded legitimization of variations in policy between England and Scotland, but would be used by the separatist movement in Scotland, the secessionists in Scotland, the Scottish National Party and their allies, to construct the case for Scotland leaving the United Kingdom altogether. And so you heard plenty of people on the unionist side say that devolution would be a way of holding together the United Kingdom, stabilize the United Kingdom, deepening the United Kingdom, some might say. There's a very telling example of this in the Scottish devolution campaign in 1997, where Gordon Brown and Sean Connery, the actor, are on the ferry going over the Forth, and Brown and Connery are answering. Brown, of course, at the time is the newly elected Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Brown is a unionist but pro-devolution, and Connery is a devolutionist who wants Scotland to become an independent country. And so Connery tells the press that he supports devolution because it's the first step to independence. And Brown tells the press devolution is about stability, not separation. Both can't be right. And I think with nearly 3 decades of hindsight, it is now obvious to us that I think Connery was correct. Devolution provided a blueprint for an independent state, far more so than any nationalist could have dreamed, really, I think, even in the 1990s. And there were plenty of people for years who'd warned about this. Back in the 70s, you had Labour politicians like Tam Dalyell, who described devolution as a motorway to Scottish independence with no exit routes. I should also just say, I think devolution has not delivered any of the kind of economic or social outcomes that its proponents claimed. It hasn't made the country less unequal. It hasn't noticeably improved living standards in Scotland or indeed Wales. It hasn't improved education or health or environmental concerns, urban development. I mean, it has very few accomplishments to its name. And I still find it so puzzling that there seems to be a pretty large consensus across the British political class, especially on the left of centre, that even though it has so obviously failed in all of these different ways, you still hear people argue, well, the problem with devolution is that we need to see more devolution. It reminds me a bit of that line from Frederick the Great, where he described the Archduchess Maria Theresa after the partition of Poland in 1772, where he said, she cried when she took, and the more she cried, the more she took. It's a bit like that. Devolution hasn't worked. We're very upset it hasn't worked. So what we need to do is we need to double down on devolution.
Well, I never thought I'd say that Sean Connery had better political judgment than Gordon Brown, but I think you're right. With hindsight, we can say that he definitely did. Another person who did on this question was one of the key players in this entire story, and that's Alex Salmond. So Alex Salmond is in many ways the defining figure of the Scottish National Party in recent decades. And he's the SNP leader who first becomes First Minister in Scotland with devolution. And what he managed to do is change quite fundamentally the SNP's, the Scottish National Party's approach to devolution, because historically the view had been independence or nothing. And they thought that accepting devolution would basically be to give up on the dream of being a separate country altogether. But Salmond saw accurately that actually devolution was the stepping stone, much like Sean Connery would say. And that is, I think, the great insight that Alex Salmond brought to the SNP, and means that without him, realistically, there would never have been this referendum that we're discussing. And the greatest folly by far in unionism of the last half century has been the belief that devolution would kill Scottish nationalism stone dead. I mean, no more foolish people have ever existed, really, than those who adopted that view.
And what the Scottish Parliament does is it elevates the Scottish National Party from an eccentric bunch in Westminster of usually no more than half a dozen MPs to a party that eventually can position itself as the governing party of Scotland on the exact same blueprint as they would want an independent Scottish state to be. I mean, I'm not in favour of devolution for socialist reasons. I think that devolution contributes to greater inequality. Otherwise, what's the point of having it? I think it militates against the kind of redistribution that you want to have on as large a scale as possible, where it still can command democratic legitimacy. And for me, that is the British state. However, I think if the new Labour government wanted to bring in devolution, but didn't want to align it with nationalism, what they ought to have done is they ought to have split Scotland and Wales. There should have been a Northern Scotland Assembly and a Southern Scotland Assembly and a Northern Wales Assembly and a Southern Wales Assembly if they were so concerned about bringing decision-making closer to the people. And actually, I think that in some ways greatly reflects the internal politics of both of those parts of the United Kingdom. But part of the reason I think that there wasn't really much reflection on this was because in 1997, just after New Labour had won this huge majority and swept the country, including a very dominant position in Scotland and Wales, there was this complacency that Labour would always win in these parts of the country. And these parts of the country had been very anti-Thatcher, and Labour had been seen as the alternative choice for that. And so it was just assumed that these were deep red Labour parts of the UK. But that fell apart fairly quickly. By 2007, you have a SNP government being formed in Edinburgh. So tell us a little bit about how that comes about, Lee, and what are the consequences for leading up to our 14 independence referendum.
The 2007 Scottish Parliament election is incredibly close at the top of the results table. So the SNP win on votes and seats, but only just. So they get 32.9% of the vote, and for that, 47 seats. And Labour, like you say, the party that appeared dominant in Scotland, and many people thought always would be, finishes just behind them on 32.1% of the vote and 46 seats, so just one fewer MSP for Labour than the SNP. Of course, it's not just the two parties that are represented. There's also 17 Conservatives, 16 Liberal Democrats, and 2 Greens as well. And he manages to form an SNP administration in Holyrood. And even then, in that first term, he begins agitating for an independence referendum. But because there are only 50 MSPs in the Scottish Parliament in favour of having the referendum, out of 129 in total, he knows that he can't actually command enough support for it in Scotland, let alone to do what he would ultimately have to do, which is to persuade the government of the United Kingdom that they should agree to having this referendum. Because on that very point, we should make clear that the Scottish government itself, or the Scottish Parliament, does not have the legal authority to have an independence referendum itself. This is something that's become very obvious in recent years. But after this referendum, they've tried and tried and tried to do so again. The way in which devolution worked is that the UK government said, well, we will reserve certain powers and functions, but we'll devolve everything else. But a big chunk of constitutional affairs were in the reserved matters that are held and managed by the UK government. So the way in which an independence referendum could come about would be to persuade the government in Westminster that there was a mandate for it, or there was a reason to have it, and that they would therefore grant what's called a Section 30 order, which would give the temporary authority to the government in Edinburgh in order to have the vote. So what Alex Salmond needed to do is to find a way to fundamentally change the thinking in Westminster around the question. And the very least that he needed to do that was to actually have a nationalist majority in the Scottish Parliament who were willing to call for such a vote themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's just worth pausing at this moment just to further explain the constitutional dynamics of devolution, where devolution is not federalism. In federalism, you have different levels of government that have constitutionally protected prerogatives, and sometimes those policy prerogatives can overlap and be shared, and sometimes those are uniquely held by the different levels of government. Under devolution, the British Parliament, the United Kingdom Parliament, remains sovereign. It remains the supreme law-making body in the country, and the British state remains a unitary state. But what devolution does is Parliament says, we are voluntarily binding our hands and saying we will not legislate, normally speaking, on this set of policy matters. These are the policy matters that we are authorizing you to make your own decisions on. Now, in extremis, if we have a problem with what you're doing there, we can stop you. Parliament can legislate against you. In fact, we don't even need to legislate against you. The United Kingdom government can advise the monarch to withhold assent from an act of the Scottish Parliament, and that has happened in devolution. It's very rare, but it does has happened and it remains a power of the United Kingdom Parliament. And then there are some matters as part of the devolution arrangement where the UK Parliament said, we're not even allowing that degree of autonomy. We're not saying that normally speaking, you can legislate on those areas. Those are areas that belong to us. And one of those, quite sensibly, is about the continued existence of the United Kingdom, where the UK Parliament doesn't just allow any constituent bit of the United Kingdom to unilaterally decide that it's just going to leave. Something that should be not a controversial thing at all. I mean, there are basically no countries in the world that allow some part of that country just to decide on its own whenever it wants, just to go. Usually wars are fought over that kind of act. You just need to look at the United States when it dealt with secessionists in the 1860s. Politically, though, the arguments around independence change after the next set of Scottish parliamentary elections in 2011.
Well, the 2011 Scottish parliamentary elections are really one of the great political achievements of this century in terms of what Alex Salmond and the SNP managed to achieve, because the Scottish Parliament is set up under a PR, proportional representation system. They use the additional member system to choose MSPs. And unless you have overwhelming support, it is very, very difficult to win a majority in the Parliament. And of course, Scotland is a country that has had quite fragmented politics really for quite a long time, even up to this stage. There's, of course, the SNP as a separatist party. There is Labour. There's the Conservatives. There's the Liberal Democrats, who have had significant areas of strength in Scotland. There's also been some eccentric bits of the fringe left in Scotland as well, Scottish socialists and whatnot, and there's the Greens as well. So to achieve a majority in this highly fragmented political landscape with a PR electoral system is incredibly difficult. But it's what Alex Salmond manages to do for the first and only time in the history of this Scottish Parliament. The SNP wins 69 seats. That's a gain of 23. They're doing this as an incumbent government as well, it's worth pointing out. I mean, it's genuinely staggering. And their vote share is up 12.5% to 45.4%, as opposed to that razor-thin margin over Labour last time. The gap on this occasion is now about 14% in the vote, and Labour languishes on just 37 seats in Holyrood. John Lloyd, who is a unionist, wrote a book called Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot, which is a criticism of Scottish independence. And he wrote in it that, quote, leaders who use passion to frame the demand for independence and demonstrate an ability to master at least some of the complexities of government can have a powerful effect on those who had not thought of voting for a nationalist party. And I think that actually sums up really quite well what Salmond managed to achieve in 2011. And that is a sufficient jolt to people's expectations of how the Scottish Parliament would function. But also I think it's a big enough boost to the arsenal of arguments that Alex Salmond and the SNP can make that Westminster decides it has to think quite seriously about agreeing to a referendum.
I find it really absurd that the response of the United Kingdom government to the election of an SNP majority is to say, oh, well, you definitely should be allowed then to have a referendum which allows Scotland to become its own country. I think of this in terms of if some other part of the United Kingdom, let's say Oxfordshire, had a county council election where a party stood on independence for Oxfordshire and they won a majority in the county council elections, and the one key commitment they made in their manifestos was that Oxfordshire should become an independent country, you'd be laughed out the room if the leader of that county council went to the UK Parliament, went to the Prime Minister and said, we've been elected on this mandate to become an independent country. We demand a referendum to become an independent country. And just to give you a sense, I mean, Oxfordshire has 800,000 people in it. It's got a population that's double the population of independent countries like Iceland or Malta, for example. I think it's about the same population as El Salvador. So why is it that it's seen as ridiculous? Well, people would say, well, because there isn't a national identity, I think, associated with being from Oxfordshire the way that there is from Scotland. But I would argue that by giving credence to that claim from the SNP, you're actually already half the road down to accepting the legitimacy of Scottish nationalism as an independence movement. Because if you say there's something different about being Scottish than there is about being a Yorkshireman or being from Cornwall or being from Lancashire. We lived in Lancashire for many years, very proud of Lancashire. A lot of people we know in Lancashire are very proud of Lancashire. They identify as Lancashire people. They identify as Lancastrians. Does that identity have less valid identity than Scotland's identity? And people say, well, Scotland used to be an independent country. I mean, it was an independent country. The last time it was at the start of the 18th century. A lot's happened since the 18th century. So I just thought it was very peculiar that there was just so little pushback on this from the Cameron government. And it just suggested to me that actually there were quite a few people in the Cameron government who had actually swallowed some of the mythologizing that the SNP had put forward about the rights of Scotland to be a separate nation state.
Much of that I disagree with, actually. So I do think Scotland is different in terms of its claims, different to Oxfordshire, but also actually different to, say, Wales as well, in terms of how Scotland relates to the United Kingdom. Among other things, it is an identifiable nation. It also has its own legal system. It's had its own separate system of governance. Even before devolution, the way in which it was governed from Westminster was different to the way in which other parts of the UK were. And we can't wish away, I don't think, or imagine that it's only a product of nationalist politicians, that there is a very strong sense of national identity that exists in Scotland. For me, the challenge for unionists, and I very strongly consider myself to be a unionist, I am a unionist, is how to make the Scottish identity one that people can proudly hold and feel in a way that overlaps with British identity, and also a belief that Scotland's best interests are pursued through a commitment also to the British state and the apparatus of British politics. Where I have a bit of sympathy with the way in which you frame it is that it is a very surprising thing for a government to quite so willingly agree to have a referendum, which will be, as we'll come on to discuss, determined just by whoever turns out on a day in September 2014, and 50% plus one is enough to dissolve a union of 3 centuries. It's a very surprising thing, really, for a government to agree to that, because irrespective of what people think about David Cameron as a prime minister and his failure to win the Brexit referendum, in my view, undoubtedly, if he had lost Scotland as prime minister, if the United Kingdom had in any meaningful sense ceased to exist, as I think defeat in this referendum would have led to, he would have been the worst prime minister since Lord North and then some. This would have been much worse than losing the American colonies. And that he was willing to gamble on that, I think, does smack of complacency.
But it is, I think you are still buying into the nationalist line here, because there are parts of the country where there have been differing governing arrangements. People feel a very profound sense of identity for that particular part of the country. Look at London. I mean, London is governed differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. People in London often say that they feel like a Londoner first. Or you look at, in the United States, Alaska. There was a party until last year in Alaska called the Alaskan Independence Party, which was a separatist party in Alaska. And in the 1990s, they actually elected a governor in Alaska who was from this separatist party. At no point would the United States government have looked at Alaska and said, well, they've elected this separatist governor, so we should give them an independence referendum to become their own country. So I think it's absolutely fine to cherish these different identities that are part of a country, but to elevate Scottish identity above other identities plays into the hands of the Scottish separatists, in my view.
What I do find surprising is that it was really quite uncontroversial among unionists to have the referendum. And if we think back to 1886, and when Joseph Chamberlain walked out of Gladstone's cabinet over the question of Home Rule and formed the Liberal Unionists, which would eventually merge with the Conservative Party and form the Conservative and Unionist Party, as it still is. It wasn't even that Joe Chamberlain was completely opposed to any form of devolution in Ireland. He was opposed to the model that Gladstone was advocating for. So we walked out of the cabinet and would walk out of the Liberal Party.
And there were no cabinet resignations, no resignations at all, as far as I know, from the Cameron government over this.
There was really hardly any dissent at all, even though the only real precedent, and there is some precedent, it's worth saying, for having such a vote comes from 1973. There was a border poll in Northern Ireland, but that, as it happens, was boycotted by nationalists, by people who wanted the 6 counties of Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic of Ireland. And so, quite remarkably, in that case, it was 99% for staying in the United Kingdom, but that's because turnout was relatively low at 58%, although still, as you can see, a clear majority of people who could vote in Northern Ireland wanted to stay part of the UK. But that was the only precedent, really, for having such a vote in the UK. Once you concede the point of a referendum, there are a whole series of questions that you have to ask, and it's just worth running through a few of those. The first is who can vote? And in this case, actually, it was both an incredibly broad, but you could also actually argue quite narrow franchise. The sense in which it was broad is that for the first time in a Scottish election, the voting age would be reduced to 16. So Alex Salmond gets agreed that 16 and 17-year-olds will have the vote. And basically, the threshold for voting is a residency threshold. So not everybody who's resident in Scotland can vote. For example, an American living in Scotland couldn't vote. But if you're living in Scotland and a Commonwealth citizen, so of course that's Commonwealth realms, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica, elsewhere, but also other members of the Commonwealth like India and Pakistan and dozens more countries. Anybody from those countries living in Scotland could vote. And also anybody from the European Union living in Scotland could vote as well. So it's really an incredibly broad franchise in that sense. The way in which it is arguably narrow, and this was discussed a little bit at the time, is that, of course, there are a lot of people who are Scottish who don't live in Scotland, but they are part of the Scottish nation. And it could be argued, have a right to determine whether Scotland exists and governs as a separate nation, even if they just happen to temporarily live in England or elsewhere around the world. But they had no right to vote in this. It was also at one stage suggested that everybody in the United Kingdom should get a vote on it because it would affect the future existence of the United Kingdom. But that was also dismissed as well, in part, actually using the precedent of 1973 in Northern Ireland, and that being a poll just of the people who lived in that part of the country.
I think it'd be quite difficult to have a poll where only Scots, whoever they were, wherever they were in the world, could vote, because we don't have some kind of register of Scottish people. And so what would be the basis of that? Self-identification?
I don't deny it's tricky, but if I think about some people I knew at the time, to say really why I think it should have been engaged with a bit more seriously. And there are 2 people who lived in the same village. And my friend Miles, who's since died, he was born in Scotland, brought up in Scotland, got married in Scotland, owned his first home in Scotland, thought of himself as being, or was, a very Scottish person, but happened to live in England. But in the same village as him was a friend of mine who was born and brought up and had only ever lived in England until he went to university in Scotland. Now, of those 2, the person who was in every respect really but residency Scottish didn't have a vote, and the person who was English but just happened to be at university in Scotland did have a vote. Now, I agree, finding a way through that is very tricky, but when you're dealing with a question that is as fundamental and arguably as irrevocable as the status of Scotland as a separate nation, and whether the nation of Scotland is governed separately to the rest of the United Kingdom, it does feel, to me, a little oddity about the way in which you would decide that.
But there would have been all kinds of oddities. If you did it on the basis of if you were born in Scotland, then you have Tony Blair eligible to vote in the referendum, even though Blair, I don't really think, sees himself as Scottish. And on the other hand, you would have someone like Fraser Nelson, who was the editor of The Spectator, who speaks with a Scottish accent, who was brought up in the Highlands, but happened to have been born in Truro, not eligible to vote. So I think any form would have been messy. And what they basically did in Scotland was they used the electoral register of the Scottish parliamentary elections, subtracted down to 16 as the register, and very imperfect, but I think there's more logic to it. Anyway, what were the other things that they had to decide?
Well, one was the wording of the question. And the Scottish government basically, well, they were really pushing their luck with the first question that they proposed. Their idea was, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? They proposed that for the ballot paper. It's not all that much better from, don't you really think it'd be a very good idea indeed if Scotland was an independent country? And it's an absurd proposal because of those words, do you agree? It's obviously a leading question. The Electoral Commission instead proposes, and ultimately the question is, should Scotland be an independent country? I actually also have issues with this as a question, because I think independent is a positive term in many people's minds. To live independently as we age is something that we talk about positively. Americans celebrate Independence Day. A sense of being independent is something that we praise in people to some degree. And so I think having the word independence in there is actually a way in which the question was somewhat biased.
What's the opposite of independence? Dependent.
Exactly.
And someone could read that question and say, yes, I want Scotland to be an independent country. I want it to be outside of the European Union.
For me, really, the simplest way of putting the question, although I obviously didn't get any role in deciding it, would be to say something like, should Scotland be a separate country from the United Kingdom, or something like that? You could even, given what happened 2 years later, say, should Scotland leave or remain in the United Kingdom? You know, there's ways of doing it which I think would be more reasonable than the question that we ultimately got. And the other thing that had to be decided, of course, was when would it happen? And it was decided that would happen in September of 2014. Alex Salmond in particular liked 2014 for a few reasons, including that it was the anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, when the army of Robert the Bruce fought off the army of Edward II of England during what's remembered as the First War of Scottish Independence. It was also the year when, for example, Scotland was hosting the Commonwealth Games. And that was seen really as being a symbol of, look, actually, Scotland can do things. We're hosting this as Scotland, not as just a part of the United Kingdom. So it was seen as being an identity boosting year for Scotland, 2014. And so the autumn of that year was a time when Alex Salmond was pretty keen to have it.
I think there was a huge amount of complacency from the UK government in going along with a lot of this. It sounds trivial, but as you'll hear in our interview with Matthew Elliott, who directed both the AV and the EU referendum campaigns for the winning side, it's an accumulation of small victories that he credits with the victories of his side. And Alex Salmond, in particular, I think, was very canny in trying to accumulate all of these small victories to help make the path to an independence vote easier for the Scottish people.
I think that's right. I mean, it is complacent. I think if you were to defend the UK government's view somewhat, I think their view was, this is going to be a no vote. You know, we're going to win this referendum for unionism. And if we give ground to the nationalists on all these issues, we don't give them cause to complain. But that was, like you say, fundamentally complacent. But the people who weren't complacent really was actually the Scottish government, because they had the underdog spirit, you know, where they knew they had to fight on every single point and do everything they possibly could to actually deliver the outcome that they wanted, or get as close as they possibly could.
And one of the clever things that the SNP government in Scotland did was that it basically set out a plan for how they would govern an independent country, or what an independent country, an independent Scotland would look like. So Lee, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I've got it in my hands at the moment. It's called Scotland's Future, Your Guide to an Independent Scotland. It is 600 plus pages, and it's a white paper, basically, that includes page after page of questions for people to answer. Now, employers, why should companies base their headquarters in independent Scotland? Questions about the Scottish Energy Fund. You know, as I'm flicking through it, there's just so much. Scotland's democratic voice in the EU. What they're trying to do really is actually counter what will inevitably be one of the Unionists' key points in the campaign, which is to say this is a great leap into the unknown. Nobody knows what this is going to be like. This is ending centuries of the way in which we have been governed in Scotland by saying, well, actually, look, this is thought through. This isn't some sort of random on the hoof idea. There's 600 pages here answering every possible conceivable question that you could think of about how this is going to work. And by the way, and this relates back to the devolution point, it's based around a parliament that already exists and that you already vote and elect people to. So it was an incredibly effective thing, I think, that white paper. And it gets published in November 2013, which is the best part of a year before the actual referendum itself in September 2014. And I think that's also very clever because it establishes some credibility for the independence cause quite early on. And it also actually buys them a bit of space so that if the whole thing blows up, if people look through it and say, oh, this really isn't very satisfactory, they've got time to think again. They've got time for people to forget the blunder. It's really quite a smart move, I think, to show that they are being very, very serious in terms of how they're approaching it.
So let's get to the campaign itself. So as I think will become clear to our listeners, during the 3 Cameron referendums, there is a fairly common template that's been followed in terms of the legality of the campaigns themselves, in which you have 2 official designated campaigns that are there to be the official voices of either side of the referendum, which are eligible for certain forms of state support. In some cases, that's funding. In other cases, which wasn't the case in Scotland, but in other cases like space to advertise on television and radio and so on. So what did that look like specifically in the Scotland independence referendum?
Well, one of the things I really want to try and make clear is that this is a long campaign, basically. And one of the signs that it's a long campaign is that the 2 principal campaigning groups, what would be Yes Scotland for independence and what would be Better Together for the Union, are founded more than 2 years before the vote itself takes place. So a much longer timescale than what we'll have with the European Union referendum that we'll talk about next week. This is, in fact, something that Alex Salmond was quite keen on, this long timescale. In fact, he wrote at the time, we need time to gear up a campaign to take us from the low 30s to over 50%. So he wanted this long lead-in period. If we start by talking about the Yes campaign, so overall, if we think about finances, the Yes campaign raises £4.5 million. And amazingly, the vast majority of the Yes campaign's money comes from 2 people, a married couple called Chris and Colin Weir. And in 2011, they won the Euro Millions. Lucky them. In fact, not so lucky them. They subsequently divorced and Colin Weir died 8 years after the win. But of their great money, they gave £3.5 million to the campaign for independence, a campaign that in total would only spend 4.5 million, like a staggering amount of money and staggering donation. In terms of how the Yes campaign approached the issue, Alex Salmond really was front and centre in a great many respects. And that had positives and negatives, mainly positives, I think it's fair to say, for the independence cause. One of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to try and drag David Cameron as much as he could into the issue because the Conservatives were still not well represented in Scotland. There was 1 Scottish Conservative MP. There were more than that now, for what it's worth. The Scottish Conservatives are stronger now than they were then.
1 more recently. They just won a by-election in Aberdeen.
Absolutely. And this was part of a general approach from Salmond, which was really to play on the strength of feeling around Scottish national identity and to highlight to the way in which that jarred with Scotland's political identity and its ability to deliver for what Scotland really wanted. And one of the things if I say my view on Alex Salmond, I think he was a very flawed man, but a very remarkable politician. And one of the things that I think he was very remarkable at, and it stands out in this context in particular, was putting Scotland and his vision for Scotland and his view of a separate Scotland into a long and broad historical framework. And so he wrote, for example, that, quote, every movement for radical change in Scotland, from Jacobite to Jacobin, from crofting liberals to the early Labour movement, was overlaid by Scottish nationalism. So he was speaking about a sense of Scotland as a nation and Scotland as a radical nation at times and its achievements in a way that connected it all into a view and a vision of Scotland as a separate country. I mean, it's sort of remarkable. I quite like that quote. There's loads you can pick out like that because it's hard to imagine any Scottish nationalist since who can speak with the same depth and breadth about the country as Salmond could. Another strength I think is just worth highlighting about the separatist campaign is that by this stage it's becoming clear, and I think it's continued actually a great deal since, that the SNP were becoming dominant, not just in Scottish politics, but actually in very large parts of Scottish civil society and elsewhere. An example of this that I sometimes use is at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, there is a rock which was unveiled by Salmond himself when he was First Minister, which contains a quote from Alex Salmond. And it's a riff on the Burns poem, A Red, Red Rose. And it says in this rock, "The rocks will melt with the sun before I allow tuition fees to be imposed on Scotland's students." Now, I mean, this is just actually kind of crazy if you think about it. This is an incumbent First Minister having basically a party political slogan about a policy question celebrated at a university in the country. I mean, it's almost the equivalent of, I don't know, having a Keir Starmer quote about, I am serving in the national interest, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield to Britain's enemies, something silly like that, that Keir Starmer, as an incumbent Prime Minister, would go and unveil at University College London and would just be accepted. I mean, I think this is evident, really, of the way in which the SNP and Scottish nationalism was actually becoming ingrained in so many parts of Scotland's national life. And that was something that the Yes campaign could tap into, really, throughout much of the campaign.
One thing I think that's different about the Scottish independence referendum compared to the AV referendum, the EU referendum, is that the losing side of the referendum was actually very well organized and quite well pitched and had done a lot of the groundwork in the lead up to the referendum to position themselves in their strongest possible position. I think that cannot be said in the same way for Britain Stronger in Europe or for the Yes to Fairer Votes campaigns, both of which I think were very deeply flawed. But in the case of the Scotland vote, what I think we can also say is that there was a very well organized alternative to the Yes to Independence campaign, the No campaign, the Better Together campaign. Do you agree with me that Better Together was also very well organized and a good match for Salmond, or do you think that it was somewhat flawed?
I think it was both. So in some respects, it was clearly a capable and competent campaign. So they raised money, for example, well. In fact, about a month before polling day, they stopped accepting donations because they had more money than they were legally able to spend during the campaign. Among their donors, out of interest, was J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author, who gave £1 million to Better Together. The way in which I sometimes think about the Unionist campaign in 2014 was that it basically lacked soul, but it had a couple of killer arguments that the nationalists could not really answer. And the biggest of those, I think, was about the currency and what currency would an independent Scotland use. And there were basically three options that it would have faced. It could use its own currency, it could try and use the euro, or it could use sterling still, the pound sterling. As we got towards the end of the campaign, that really became the number one talking point of the Unionist message, partly because Alex Salmond argued that an independent Scotland would use the pound still. But in that summer, George Osborne and Ed Balls, the Chancellor and Shadow Chancellor respectively, they both ruled out a currency union between an independent Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So it didn't look like it would actually be happening because the rest of the UK wouldn't agree to it. In some ways, I actually think that backfired, really. Salmond would make points about, this is our pound too, you can't just sort of take it away from us. And he would mockingly refer to it as George Osborne's Sermon on the Pound, in reference to a Margaret Thatcher speech in the 1980s, the Sermon on the Mount, in which he lectured the Church of Scotland. But fundamentally, it didn't change the fact that they didn't have a good answer to what currency they would use. And there's a slight irony, really, in all of this, where if you take the Salmond view that, well, we'll use the pound anyway, you would basically be accepting that the management of your currency and things like interest rates would be determined by the Bank of England in London, an institution over which there is no control that Scotland would have really at that stage. So you would be fighting for independence and more control in Edinburgh, whilst proposing that you have less control over your currency than you do under the current arrangement. This was seen as such a strength for the Unionists that when there were two debates, so Alex Salmond actually wanted a debate with David Cameron in this, but Cameron quite wisely said no. And the head of the No campaign, Alistair Darling, the former Labour Chancellor under Gordon Brown, he instead debated Alex Salmond twice. And the first one was seen as a Darling win, in part because of the currency question. He really hammered him on the currency, and Salmond was floundering somewhat. The second time round, Darling basically did the same thing again. He brought the currency straight back up. And it didn't really work the second time around. It started to look as if the Unionist campaign was a bit thin in terms of the points it was making. But as that core seed of doubt to plant in swing voters' minds, the idea that actually these guys don't even know the currency that your savings, the currency that your mortgage, the currency that your salary is going to be paid in if they win, it was enough to really take a lot of the wind out of the Yes campaign sails. But what they always had throughout, I think, was a campaign that, on the Yes side, was a campaign that was filled with a lot of soul and a lot of passion and a lot of, sort of determination to win. They were in many ways the most vocal parts of the referendum campaign, was the people arguing for yes. And you could see this actually in some of the closing arguments, in particular from the No campaign. So one of the things that stands out in my mind is that Gordon Brown made a very celebrated speech in this campaign calling for a no vote. Gordon Brown, of course, former Prime Minister, former Chancellor, Scottish, not just Scottish in the sense of being born in Scotland, still lives in Scotland today, represented a Scottish constituency throughout his time as an MP. He gives a speech where he's walking around this room that is plastered with red love hearts that say, "Love Scotland, vote no," inside of them. And he talks up this idea of a silent majority in Scotland and a silent majority who believe in the Union and want to vote no. But really, the fact that he's referring to the silence of what he hopes is a majority reflects the fact that really a lot of the energy and the activity has come from those calling for a yes vote.
I remember all this happening, and I found it to be curiously transactional in how people thought about voting for independence. The arguments ended up sort of being, well, will you be, £500 better off if you stay in the UK versus if you leave the UK? And if this is a question of core national identity, who is the demos in our democracy? Are we a country where we have a sense of national solidarity with people who live in Newcastle and Swansea, just as much as we do people who live in Aberdeen or Stirling? Then really some of these arguments feel a bit by the by to me. However, clearly the No campaign, calculated that actually for many voters, these questions of household finances were at the fore. I think it again goes to show to me how referendums are very flawed decision-making devices.
What it speaks to, I think, is that, and actually the comparison with Ireland is an apt one, that if you go to, say, 1920s and what would become the Republic of Ireland, or 1973 in Northern Ireland, people's sense of their nationhood and nationality and how politics should reflect that is incredibly deeply felt. Now, for a big chunk of people in Scotland in 2014, it is as well. There is a block of voters who are determinedly unionist, and there is a block of voters who are determinedly nationalist or separatist. But there is also a huge chunk in the middle who could go either way. And you are right, that makes this really quite unique in some respects in terms of deciding on a nation, because it's something where you would usually expect the strength of feeling on it to be much, much stronger. But that doesn't detract from the fact that, of course, this was a very highly charged, often quite emotional, very peaceful, but occasionally with flashes of violence in terms of people throwing eggs at politicians and whatnot. Mostly inappropriate, but nobody was really harmed sort of stuff, but things that you shouldn't really do. But it was remarkably peaceful as an attempt to secure separate nationhood goes in the vast sweep of history. As we get towards polling day, though, this big day, this date of destiny, the 18th of September 2014, the polls, which have very consistently, as he showed, that no would win. There's not been a stage in any of the first 8 months of 2014 when yes has been ahead in the opinion polls. That changes on the 6th of September when YouGov publishes a poll that shows that yes is going to win by 2%, right? Pretty much the narrowest of possible margins. And that provokes a meltdown, basically. Among other things, it convinces David Cameron and others that actually this could be lost. He could be the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He could be the next day speaking to the Queen to basically tell her that he's lost the country, something he later said that he did not want to do, and described the relief that he felt when telling her that the no side had won. It also actually convinces the Westminster political class that what they have so far tried to make a Scottish question fought between Scottish politicians. David Cameron has had a bit of an arm's length approach to this because he sees the weakness of having an English Conservative MP arguing for the Union in this case. That's why Alistair Darling has been so central to it. It basically convinces a lot of them that the No campaign may have bungled this, that they could have blown this enormous lead that they started with a couple of years ago. And that produces something called the Vow. And this was a letter jointly signed by David Cameron as leader of the Conservatives, Ed Miliband as leader of Labour, and Nick Clegg, the leader of the Lib Dems, in which they basically make a joint commitment to Scotland. And I won't read all of it, but it says this. The people of Scotland want to know that all three main parties will deliver change for Scotland. We are agreed that the Scottish Parliament is permanent and extensive new powers for the Parliament will be delivered by the process and to the timetable agreed and announced by our three parties starting on the 19th of September, the very next day after the vote, if there's a no vote. It goes on to say things like, because of the continuation of the Barnett allocation for resources, that's a way in which money is dished out between the constituent parts of the UK, and the powers of the Scottish Parliament to raise revenue, we can state categorically that the final say on how much is spent on the NHS will be a matter for the Scottish Parliament, etc. It's not quite what was sometimes called Devo Max, and we didn't get the chance in this episode to really talk about what was sometimes floated as alternative questions on the ballot paper, with some people wanting one option to be a maximalised form of devolution as a third option, rather than this binary of independence or union. But it basically says to them, well, actually, Scotland is becoming, to some degree, more independent no matter how you vote on Thursday. That if you vote yes, of course, Scotland will be independent. But if you vote no, then there will be more devolution of power to Scotland than there was beforehand. Then there is subsequently another Scotland Act. And what this is reflecting, I think, and it's a tragic thing, but it does show how I think this campaign went very, very badly for the forces of unionism and for unionist arguments, is that there is a total panic on the side of how to try and preserve the country. And Westminster's politicians will almost do or say whatever they think it takes at this stage in order just to try and make sure that it's a no vote. And I actually think at the moment that the vow is made, we can say that in a sense, Alex Salmond has won the referendum, irrespective of what happens, because he has totally shaped the terms in which the question is being answered on the 18th of September.
I was furious when this vow was made, and it flipped me from being someone who wanted to see Scotland vote to stay in the United Kingdom to someone who, admittedly in a bit of a fit of pique, would have been happy to see them go. I was actually in Edinburgh the week before the referendum, and there were some yes campaigners who came up to me, and it was just after this vow. And I took a yes to independence badge. And the reason I did was because I thought, once you say that the Scottish Parliament is permanent, that the Scottish Parliament has certain permanent powers over policy, you are actually destroying the British Constitution. Because the British Constitution, the thing that I love about the British Constitution is nothing is permanent. Everything is on the table at every election. One of the core principles of the British Constitution is that no parliament can bind its successor. You do not allow the dead hand of the past to determine the fate of the future. And yet here we were, Ed Miliband, David Cameron, and Nick Clegg, presumptuously claiming that they, for all time, could bind any future United Kingdom Parliament to take out of their control the ability to change governing arrangements in this country at some point in the future, and to give permanent authority to this subsection of the United Kingdom to have these policy-making authorities. And at that point, I thought, well, if they actually deliver on the vow, as it's turned out, they haven't really, but if they had actually delivered on the vow, then we don't have the United Kingdom constitutional arrangement I know and love and care about. At that point, Scotland might as well go, because what is the point really of Scotland staying in the United Kingdom? And the mere fact, what you said earlier, Lee, about that there was this huge undecided bunch in the electorate at the time of the referendum that could be swayed sometimes by quite trivial arguments over cost, showed to me that there had been a devastating failure of the British state in the years leading up to the referendum, where basically since devolution in 1999, the United Kingdom government devolved and forgot about Scotland, as Vernon Bogdanor, the constitutional theorist, has written. Where really what the UK government should have done is to see that part of its role is to nurture a sense of Britishness, that states cannot be complacent about the nation that underpins them, that actually there is constant nation making. Nations aren't just things that exist at one moment and then just stay that way forever. That actually when you have a nation state, as we do, a British nation and a British state, that the British state needs to work to keep that going through education, through civic policies, and the way in which politicians relate to all parts of that British nation. And basically, those British politicians step back and let separatists define the terms of Scottishness. And even after that, still, they were a minority of the Scottish population, which is a miracle, really, but it shows something about how there was still a deep-rooted sense of Britishness latent in the population. And the vow just further showed that UK policymakers didn't get it, because their response to the weakness of British sentiment was to say, we shall weaken it further in the future. And at that point, I just thought, we might as well give up. Now, I look back and realize that was something of a hasty judgment that I formed at that moment. I wouldn't take that same view now, but it was an incredibly frustrating moment for me personally at the time of the referendum.
Defenders of the vow might say, well, at the very least, it worked, because when the votes were counted, the No campaign had delivered a victory. Before we come on to the details of that, though, I think the first most notable thing to say is that the turnout, as you may expect with a question of such fundamental importance, was incredibly high. So about an 85% turnout. It was the highest turnout in any election or referendum in this country since universal suffrage. The last time it got so high was in 1910, before women had the vote, and still when a big chunk of men didn't have the vote. So huge engagement. The highest turnout anywhere was in Eastern Bartonshire, where remarkably 91% of people voted. And this high turnout led in some ways to people think of this as being quite a good moment for Scottish democracy, and arguably it is, although there are many flaws about the way in which the question was put and the campaign functioned, but the engagement certainly was remarkable. So Tom Devine, the great Scottish historian, said that this was an example of a time when democratic debate went into overdrive. And the journalist Alex Massey said that it was like a steroid injection for democracy. And that actually had quite a long tail on a slight side note. So if you think about the 2015 general election, in the UK-wide turnout was 66.4%. In Scotland, the turnout was 71.1%. So a noticeably higher turnout in Scotland in the 2015 election compared to the rest of the UK. But anyway, the detail of the result is that 1.62 million people voted yes, or 44.7%, and just over 2 million people voted no, or 55.3%. 28 of the 32 council areas voted no, with just 4, Glasgow, Dundee, North Lanarkshire and West Dunbartonshire, voting yes, although it is worth saying those 4 council areas do represent a much larger percentage of the population, including, for example, Glasgow, than just the 4 of them may at first suggest. It was, in one sense, a significant victory. Now, more than 10% margin is a significant margin of victory in a referendum. And undoubtedly, it came as a relief to unionists who, in the weeks beforehand, feared losing altogether. Although there is some evidence to suggest that polling in referendums like this does tend to overestimate separatists. Stephen Fisher from Oxford has made this point. But I think if you had said to David Cameron and others, at the point at which they agreed with the Edinburgh Agreement to have this referendum in the first place, that 45% of Scots were going to vote for separatism, it might have given them a little bit of pause for thought. And just to wrap up some of my thoughts on this, this is an issue I care about hugely, and I think it is one of the defining moments in 21st century British politics. It didn't settle the question. It opened up divides much further still. It led to a SNP landslide in the 2015 general election in Scotland, thankfully something that has since receded significantly. It helped perpetuate continued SNP government in Scotland. We are now at the stage where every First Minister in Scotland since 2007 has been a nationalist, which is something I think this referendum made more likely to continue than less. I think unionism, which struggled throughout this campaign, actually remains in quite a weak position, sort of institutionally, not necessarily in terms of its ability to actually win the majority, the silent majority, or potentially even the very significant majority of Scottish opinion. I do think it is true to say that unionism is much more closer to being the settled will of the Scottish population than separatism. But it's a deeply, deeply worrying thing for unionists that, in fact, it is probably more plausible to say that there isn't currently a settled will than that there is one. 2 final thoughts. One of them is that I actually think we think about this in the rest of the United Kingdom. And as regular listeners will know, Richard and I live in Oxfordshire in England. I think we don't think about this issue and about Scotland anyway near as much as we should. And it's a notable change from if we go back 100, 150 years or so. Now, there were decades when the Irish question dominated the politics of the United Kingdom. And really, even though this is a different context in many respects, partly because Scotland is, to the extent it is, keen to leave, much less keen to leave than what became the Republic of Ireland was. But fundamentally, the rest of the UK is, I think, much less devoted to unionism than it was in the past. And I actually think that is a concern itself. And finally, for me, this really exposes some of the big, big problems with referendums, which of course is a theme of this mini-series. And one of them is that the losers don't have to accept that they've lost. They don't actually have to see defeat as being permanent. And you can see that in the years that have followed 2016. It took barely any time at all for the SNP to start saying, actually, we need another independence referendum. Nicola Sturgeon would rarely stop talking about it. And I think when we look at the way these things work, and we look at the way referendums function as a way to settle issues like this, there is a fundamental bias towards the change position, because the SNP will never stop arguing for a referendum on independence. And then once they've won, that will be it. Now, if ever they get a referendum again, and if that referendum votes yes, then the United Kingdom is effectively dissolved. And I don't think it will be reformed, realistically. And no referendum that votes for the union will ever be seen as final for people who want to separate the country. And so I don't think from a unionist perspective that is actually tolerable. And if we continue to accept, and mercifully recent governments in the United Kingdom haven't, that simply the Scottish Parliament wishing to have a referendum is enough for them to get a referendum, then we will surely guarantee that the United Kingdom will end. And so I certainly hope that, in fact, we do not agree, unless something much more fundamental changes, to having another vote like this.
I think the British political class did not learn the right lessons from this referendum, which was really to say this near miss shows you how complacent we have been in terms of making an argument for the British nation and for the British nation state and for the United Kingdom as the governing authority of the whole of the United Kingdom. And instead, there was this consensus that you saw among politicians in the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats and Labour. I also saw it quite profoundly in academia, which was that the lesson of the Scottish independence referendum was to loosen the ties even further, to give more powers to Scotland. You saw that the majority Conservative government of David Cameron after the 2015 general election unbelievably legislate to give more powers to the SNP-led government in Scotland to put into legislation that the Scottish Parliament could never be abolished without a referendum in Scotland. As it happens, there's no way of actually enforcing that. If a future government legislates to repeal that, then it's repealed, thankfully. But the point remains that the response of the Conservative Party, the Conservative and Unionist Party, was actually to do less for the Union by giving more power to the separatist forces in Edinburgh. And I just think that was a catastrophic mistake. There are all kinds of things, actually, in hindsight, that the Unionists could have done to murky the waters, not just about the currency. I think there should be more discussion about partition in Scotland. Right? You should say, well, what about the areas that strongly want to stay within the United Kingdom? The people in Scotland who feel strongly British and do not want to lose their connection to Britain, should they be allowed to stay part of the United Kingdom? We didn't just give all of the island of Ireland one unitary separate state. And of course, that's why we have Northern Ireland. Could it be that the parts of Scotland that's felt on the border with England, that feels strongly connected to England, are allowed to stay part of the United Kingdom? No one dares mention these points, but actually they're really quite relevant points to make if you're actually serious about holding your country together and fighting for your country rather than tiptoeing around it and just hoping that you just stay together through inertia.
We always finish by talking about some of the books we're reading at the moment. And I've been thinking about what I might recommend about this. There's quite a lot of good books about the independence referendum and about Scotland and Scottish nationalism. They always date a little bit, but of course that's part of the point of history. Of course it dates when you read it. But what I thought I'd recommend is one that's come out more recently, because it dates from just 2020. And it's this John Lloyd book that I mentioned actually in passing before, Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot? Subtitle, The Great Mistake of Scottish Independence. And I think why I'd recommend that book is that it's able to take account of what's happened in the years since. This was an incredibly highly charged moment, the lead up to it and the immediate aftermath of it. Even the books were written very shortly afterwards, when there was the SNP landslide in 2015, the Brexit vote, etc. Sometimes it takes time for events to settle and for the tempest to calm before we can really begin to see things a bit more in perspective. So I think Lloyd's book does a good job of doing that. It's an argument against separatism, as obviously the subtitle suggests, but I think it's a well put one. It's a few years since I read it, but I certainly enjoyed reading it and dipping back in to some of the arguments that it makes in preparation for this episode.
And the book that I'll recommend on this topic is Scotland's Choices, The Referendum and What Happens Afterwards by Ian MacLean and Guy Lodge. This book came out before the referendum. One of the authors of this book, Ian MacLean, was one of my PhD supervisors when I was at Oxford, and this referendum, in fact, took place while I was a graduate student at Oxford. So Ian and I used to talk about these issues. Ian and Guy are, I would say, somewhat more balanced on this issue than me. What this book does is it dissects all of those different choices that would have to be made as Scotland separated from the United Kingdom, whether that was not just about the currency, but about the state pension, about oil, about energy, about Scotland's membership of the European Union, about even things like who gets to hold the works of art that are currently displayed in Scotland, or the Scottish works of art that are currently displayed in England, and everything in between. It was, in a way, an academic reflection on many of the issues that had been raised by the Scottish government in their white paper that we talked about in this episode. So if you want to see something that was written sort of in the moment of the referendum campaign, but from a serious academic register, I recommend Scotland's Choices.
Well, that's all for this episode. On Tuesday, we'll have a special extra episode where we interview Matthew Elliott, Lord Elliott, the chief exec of the Vote Leave campaign. That'll be coming out on the 10-year anniversary of the vote to leave the European Union. On Thursday, we'll be back with Matters of Interest. And then on Sunday, we're talking about that very referendum 10 years ago, Cameron's final roll of the dice that ended his political career. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.